and taking your Thursday afternoon to spend with us. Again, we are here at CAWTAC meeting number 27 on September 4th. Good to see you all again. Hope you had a good holiday weekend. If you remember back before the holiday, the last meeting, we took kind of a big picture view of Goal 10, excuse me, and then we reviewed all the ground we've covered within the Division 8 rules, topics, housing capacity analysis, land use efficiency measures, development ready land inventories, and fair housing choice. And also, thanks to everyone who reached out via email after the meeting to share additional comments. I won't call people out because I think I'll forget people, but of course, your written comments are extremely helpful as we continue to refine rules and guidance. Today, we are going to talk about some Goal 14 items, including draft rules for urban growth boundary exchanges and about urban reserve areas. Before we get into those topics, I believe Jenna is going to introduce our racial equity framework focus area. And Maddie, if you could pull up the PowerPoint, that would be great.
Yeah, well, I'll just start as Maddie's pulling that up. So the key, let's see. Oh yeah, no, that's good. Thank you. So for today's racial equity framework focus area, we are again choosing to focus on accountability. And if you remember from our last CowTAC meeting, this is an area that we focused on when talking about rules in Division 8. So we're going to continue on with that focus for today's conversation for urban reserve areas in Division 21 and UGB exchanges in Division 24. And we can go to the next slide. So one of the key questions under this focus area are, in the draft rules for UGB exchanges and urban reserve areas, what are the accountability measures for both DLCD and local governments? I've identified a couple accountability measures. There's likely more. But the first one, going back to the rulemaking direction for the capacity and urbanization rules, and that's included in your discussion memo. Part of the direction includes reducing analytical burden, minimizing procedural redundancy, and increasing clarity and certainty for local governments, especially for smaller cities pursuing UGB amendments, exchanges, or urban reserves, or a housing need consistent with the appropriate protection of resource lands. And so, something to keep in mind is to ensure that we are accountable to this. Do the draft rules implement this rulemaking direction? And for local governments, how do the rules address accountability for ensuring that land within existing urban reserves is planned for and utilized before adding more land? Because once land is in urban reserves, that of course, demonstrates intention for that land to then be added or eventually added to the UGB and urbanized. And if that land is in existing URAs is continually skipped over, that doesn't give the general public and community members a whole lot of certainty in terms of where they expect the city to grow and urbanize. So in thinking about how to be accountable to the public when it comes to designating and bringing in land from urban reserves, that's something to think about. And then the last key question for consideration is, what are the challenges and opportunities for accountability for DLCD and local governments? And what are some ideas to address this? So we know that there are a lot of barriers when it comes to infrastructure, for example, and we've definitely talked about this in this TAC. So what are some ways for how to get around these challenges within the draft rules? So hopefully these questions are helpful for thinking about how we can implement this racial equity framework focus area. And I will hand it back to you, Steve. Thanks.
Thank you for setting the stage there, Jenna. Um, so our first topic today is UGB exchanges, and this is our first look at these, I believe. So we're going to use our format where following the presentation, we'll um, pause for clarifying questions, and I mean clarifying questions, and then we'll do the poll and discussion. And Karin is going to lead us through both of our topics today. Karin, welcome back. We missed you last meeting. I'm sure you missed us as well.
Right, I was thinking of you all as us paddling in that lake. So just back to our rulemaking charge, the legislative direction, and then the charge for LCDC. So our commission, or LCDC, is asked to prioritize the rulemaking in respect to urbanization and capacity analysis to provide greater clarity and legal certainty, to reduce the analytical burden, minimize procedural redundancy. And they're asked to do all of this consistent with the appropriate protection of resource lands. So in that effect, they will be balancing all of this, and ultimately they are the deciders if these draft rules do this appropriately. So kind of wanted to ground you in that. And I think what you'll see, it's probably been, let's see, gosh, it was December of last year when we last talked about UGB exchanges. So if we go to the next slide, I'm hoping that what you saw in the memo and what you saw in the proposed draft rules kind of jogged your memories around what we discussed. And you'll see the proposed rule amendments hopefully reflect some additional clarity and certainty, but also some additional flexibility, and provides options for cities looking at UGB exchanges. So what were those highlights that I would direct you to in the memo or in the draft rules? And if we go to that next slide, I've just listed a few things for you. The term substantially equivalent has been practiced and used for quite some time now. We add clarity there by putting a numerical direction on that for a 10% margin. We also add additional flexibility within that to say the 10% margin applies to the quantity of acres and not necessarily the residential capacity, therefore giving local jurisdictions a little bit more option and flexibility there. Typically, you've had to swap out buildable land for buildable land. We're hoping to add more flexibility, and you'll see that in the rules, that you can swap out land that is not deemed buildable or is constrained and bring in land that is more buildable. In addition, what's swapped out, we've changed a little bit on this like for like. If you're swapping out a certain amount of acres that's substantially equivalent, what's swapped in can be designated at higher densities if you so choose. So I think we've added some clarity a bit there, and we've added some additional flexibility and options. I thought what I would do is, because this is the first time you're seeing rule language beyond the concepts that we discussed previously, if there's any questions that would help you, take the poll. Otherwise, we'll go straight to the poll and say, hey, did we hit the mark? Are we close? Are we way off in left field? Like, you don't remember discussing any of this. This is not what you signed on for. But is there any questions you'd like to pose to staff right now that might help you take that poll? I love awkward silences. Yay, Damien, Brock, no more awkward silence.
Very cow. Okay, plenty. Just took them a second to warm up. Damien, kick us off.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yep.
I had a clarifying question on, let's see, I'm looking at the UGB exchange rules, page 2, sub 3, the new big B, but following the small b, regarding land that is added or designated for the same residential uses and at the same or higher housing density. So I want to clarify that that's an option that a local government would have, but it's not a legal requirement that they would have to explain with findings about why they're not increasing density in this expansion area.
Correct. It's an
Okay.
additional option without any requirements attached to it. And I'm going to save this for discussion, but Damien, I really would like to talk with the TAC. When you look at little a and little b, I feel like little b provides so many more options that you just highlighted that my question remaining is why even have little a? But we had it in the record that some members of the TAC were like, we like having both. A is sort of the status quo, what we're operating under today. And you're correct, Damien, if that helps you clarify for where we're at and taking the poll in a minute or two. It is an option.
All right, thank you.
Mary Kyle.
My questions are in the same area as Damien's, and maybe you're going to explain this later. And I apologize, I have to jump for a conflicting meeting at 2. That doesn't mean you have to explain it before I leave. I'll catch up. I'll watch the thing. But I'm not understanding that Y and A and a B. And so it sounds like and in a little a big B, why the land coming in would have to be designated at the same residential use and same housing density when what we're taking out might well have been constrained land, right? That might be swapping out constrained land for buildable land. So hopefully we'd get more density. And I think it's in the little b, things that are limited to like 10% of this or that. I'm just wondering what's the rationale behind any of that as opposed to getting as much as we can out of whatever's coming in. So it's, again, just a question on that same area that Damien has questions in. So.
Yeah, I had 2 questions, Mary Kyle, that might help you take the poll. Why the little a and why the little b? And you can see little a is pretty much the status quo with
right.
very minor refinements. And some folks wanted to keep it in. I question why we keep it in. So I don't have a good answer for you. You don't have to wait till after 2 o'clock because I don't have an answer. Little b was really what we heard and how we're responsive to. We heard there were barriers to utilizing the UGB exchange. And little b is the response to that. And I'm curious to hear if we need little a, but you might have to wait for the recording when we get in discussion, right, Mary Kyle, about that. And then the 10% margin has been practiced for quite some time. So we are clarifying that and codifying that in rule, except it's been practiced that it has to be within a 10% margin for the quantity of acres and the estimated capacity, residential capacity. We're saying it just has to be the quantity of acres and give more flexibility to your point that if they want to upzone, or not, it wouldn't be upzoning, but if they want to exchange out land at lower densities, they can bring in land at much higher designation.
Which I hope it could be more than 10% over what the existing density.
It can. Yep.
It might not need as much land. You might need even 10%.
Quick clarification for everybody, the 10% only applies to the quantity of acres.
For the quantity.
So it does not matter, Mary Kyle, what you bring in, how you want to designate it, how high you want to go with densities. That's irrelevant to the 10%.
Okay. That is that's the other part.
Brand new. Yep.
Also, what if you could get even more capacity on 25% less land or something? It just, anyway.
Correct. Yep. You spot on.
Because we've heard some lands just have a lot of wetlands or they're very steep slopes. So you could reach those densities and more with substantially less land. And it just seems like there should be that flexibility. Okay, that was it. Thanks.
All right, Heather, and then Brock, and then we'll take our poll.
Okay, apologies. It's in the same area. So, and I think I was probably one of those people that said, hey, keep or add as many options as we can to give the flexibility. So I'll just say that. So my understanding, I had to read 3A and 3B 3 little a and 3 little b a couple of times. Is 3A little a about the amount of buildable land removed, and 3BA, big A, is about the total land removed? I'm just trying to, okay,
Nope.
can you explain those for me?
Little a is the status quo that you may remove buildable land and you can add buildable land. The only thing that's new in little a is that 10% margin quantity of acres. That's it. A is the status quo.
Yeah, I got the
propose
status quo part. I was just trying to understand like what type of land we're talking about in A versus B. So
A is buildable land and
okay.
B is residential land. Those are the two words you want to key on. Notice A says buildable land removed and little b says residential land removed. So we
So
don't
A
care.
could be either residential or employment buildable.
No, it all has to be under
Oh, it's
residential.
residential. Yeah.
But
Okay.
it's
A.
inventoried as buildable. So it's residential buildable land, and little b is inventory, may not be inventoried at all. It may be residentially designated within a residential designation, but it was never inventoried as buildable for whatever reason. And you can swap it out.
Okay.
So B
Interesting.
is
Okay, thank
new
you.
and A maintains the status quo in that way.
Got
Buildable
it.
is residential, which is both buildable and not inventory.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Brock?
Yeah, and again, same pieces here, but looking at little b, big B, and I guess it's in little a, big B too, but designated for the same residential use. How are we defining that? Because if we're bringing in buildable land or residential land, depending A or B, right? Why is that
Yeah, it
necessary?
just has to maintain a residential use versus like a mixed use or a commercial use, but it maintains the same residential use, not necessarily the same residential designation.
Okay, and zoning doesn't necessarily have to be the same, but
Yeah, I mean, some cities aren't even zoning land. Most cities aren't zoning land. They just designate it and bring it in.
Great. Cassara?
Might be an add-on kind of to Proc's question, since we've been talking about complete neighborhoods and having those neighborhoods supporting commercial uses, that would this swap in any way hinder an ability to swap out some residential land and then be able to plan for commercial if you weren't intending to do necessarily a employment land swap?
I wouldn't say it hinders anything new. It maintains the status quo, Sarah. You can't swap out residential land and bring in commercial.
All right. Maddie, if you could advance the slide to the poll slide, I think. Yeah. And then Ingrid, why don't you pull up our poll and everyone let us know if you support the approach as is, support with some minor modifications, or if you think this area of UGB exchanges needs a lot more work. I'm really glad we have a lot of our different jurisdictional representatives on our call today, because this certainly impacts counties as well as cities and service providers. So it'll be good to get a lot of perspectives. And it looks like it's pretty unanimous that people think this needs a little bit of refinement. So who wants to volunteer to share with us what refinement you think is needed? Martha.
Thanks. I have a lot of thoughts rattling around in my head like usual, and I will try to streamline my comments. I think I support the direction this is going. I think that there are some challenges in the way that it's written. It's a little confusing, the three little a, little b. Particularly, and I understand this is status quo, but it still doesn't make sense to me under little a, big A. How do you calculate a type of residential need is within 10% of an amount of land removed? Like that doesn't make sense to me. I thought we were talking about land versus land. And so maybe that needs some tweaking if you mean actual buildable land versus buildable land, because I thought that's what I heard you said it meant. And I'm not even 100% sure we need the A anymore either. I probably was one of the ones that said, no, keep all the options too, like Heather. But I think we can consider maybe taking that out. And then I'm curious under 3 little b, you're comparing the amount of buildable land you're adding to the total amount of residential land you're taking away, and you have to be within 10% of that. And is that really what we're aiming for here? I fully support this idea of being able to take residential land out. It doesn't have to be buildable residential land, but I'm just in my mind, I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to calculate all of these things if I'm trying to calculate it. And so I found those a little confusing, and I think maybe it just needs like some clarification. I'm I am I feel very strongly that the use of the term same residential uses is going to be taken to mean single family or multifamily or the same type of residential use. I think that if we can just get rid of the word same, because we're pulling out residential land, it just has to be designated for residential use, and then it can be the same or higher density. I think that that is more accurate and clear. And then finally, I see lots of hands going up. I'm a little confused about the lumping employment and public land together. And so I don't know if we want to have a separate conversation about that. Um, it seems to imply you can take public land out of the UGB and only replace it with employment land. And I don't think that was probably the intent. And I'm not sure why or how public land got lumped in only with an employment land. And maybe that area should just be non-residential land. I don't know. But those are my thoughts right now. But like I said, I generally support this
Thanks,
idea.
Martha. I heard basically some questions about the language and how some of these things might be calculated. I didn't know if Beth, that was what you wanted to weigh in on. I thought so. And then Karin, if you have anything to add, and then before we move on.
The clarification of within 10% instead of substantially equivalent is helpful. Because that's when I was doing some land swaps, that's the feedback that I had from DLCD staff, that substantially equivalent was within 10%. If you imagine taking out some land and you're trying to bring in land and you're trying to bring in, say, whole tax lots, if you had to be exact or a lot more exact, then it starts to become harder to do it. So the 10% is, at least gives you something that you're specifically aiming at. So that was my comment.
Thanks, Beth. Did you have anything to add, Karin, before we move on?
No, I think I just want to take this and we'll work the rules.
Okay, Ted.
Thank you. So I'll pick up on that 10% part. I do think that's helpful clarification as well. It's something that we grappled with a little bit in our urban growth boundary exchange at Metro that we conducted a few years ago. What is substantially equivalent? So that's helpful. And then just a few odds and ends. It looks like some of the statutory references need to be updated because there was some renumbering that has happened over the last several years. So for instance, in number 2, the reference to 197.764, I think that probably needs to be 197A now. But yeah, check those. On number 3, it says you can rely on its most recent lands needs analysis. I'm wondering if for consistency with all the other work that we've been doing, if it makes sense to reference the housing capacity analysis specifically. Though one thing that came up in our UGB exchange was, well, can we rely on our most recent Goal 14 locational factors analysis, or do we need to update that as well for selecting the exchange area? So that would be, I think, helpful if we can clarify that we could do that, rely on that existing analysis. Bigger picture question about the issue of removing constrained land from the urban growth boundary. I don't understand the motivation behind that. There are good reasons to have lands with environmental features or constraints as they may be inside urban growth boundaries. They're open space, natural areas. And it's something that you can account for in your buildable land inventory. So for me, that begs the question of, is there actually a need for an expansion that you're getting around by removing constrained land from the UGB. So that's sort of a bigger policy issue, I think. Applying comp plan designations. This is under the big B. Local government must apply comp plan designations. So Metro manages our urban growth boundary, but we don't apply comp plan designations. So that needs a little bit of tweaking, I think, to recognize the different circumstance that we have in the metro region, where that would be done by the county, presumably. And then last thing, another one that came up in our urban growth boundary exchange was, well, what becomes of the land that gets removed from the boundary in terms of urban reserve designations, if you're a jurisdiction that does in fact have urban reserves like we do. I don't know that there's a solution to that in rules. It seems like you probably need some statutory changes to make that more automatic, that those areas become urban reserve, but I'll toss it out there. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, Steve, if I could, I think of just wanting most of your comments, I think we'll go back and look at refinement. Some of them are specific to Metro and don't apply, but you asked a general question that maybe is a policy question of why are jurisdictions asking to remove constrained land? Here in the Metro region, we would just designate them as open spaces. They could be a great natural resource or whatever it may be. I guess the best case scenario is maybe League of Oregon Cities or other jurisdictions can respond. There are several jurisdictions around the state that have residentially designated land that in their original acknowledgement, maybe erroneously were brought into the UGB under a residential designation. And they can't take it out because then they are not satisfying the goal 10 requirements. They show a deficit of residential capacity. So it's a situation that we may not find in Metro, but we found it in a few jurisdictions around the state.
Well, so if there's a deficit, then they can do an urban growth boundary expansion, is I guess my point.
That's a big lift for some jurisdictions, and they would like to do an exchange with additional flexibility. So yeah, it just adds options for some jurisdictions that have less resources and capacity than maybe the Metro region. But I'll leave it at that. And Ted, we can definitely get other jurisdictions to tell you, hey, this is why we need it. Things are different over here on the coast or in Eastern Oregon or whatever that may be. Thank you. Thank you. That is all very helpful.
All right. Before we go to Damien, Alexandria, do you want to chime in here? We can wait.
I just realized that I hadn't changed my name. Sorry, it's just an ominous League of Oregon Cities. I promise I'm a real person. Yeah, so this is actually more of a problem for our coastal jurisdictions. Our smaller cities are, Eastern Oregon jurisdictions who A, don't have a ton of land within their UGB, and B, the just kind of UGB expansion process is frequently overly kind of onerous and costly in terms of conducting, and especially if you have land that should have never been included in your UGB to begin with. It's resource land, it's high value ag land that was designated as residential way back when for whatever reason, but you don't want to use this high value, ag or forest land for kind of a non-intended purpose, not kind of its highest and best use, and you would like to remove it from your UGB and swap it for something a little bit more eligible. That's a lower bar for entry than a full kind of UGB expansion, because you don't necessarily want to keep that farm or forest land that is, not going to be able to be developed, but also not used for if we're talking, high value farmland, it's much harder to develop, high value farmland into its highest and best use, which is agriculture, if it's sitting within a UGB.
Thank you.
So that's the high level.
Perfect. Damien.
All right, thank you. I wanted to go back to page 2, 3, small b, big B again, regarding the language on land added is designated for the same residential uses and at the same or higher housing density. Because I think here's the conundrum I'm trying to solve in my head. while the rules would allow a city to use their existing land needs analysis, how would they use OHNA in this kind of situation where they're they're actually going through and updating their comprehensive plan, they've completed their contextualized housing need, the new housing needs, their new housing capacity analysis is the only kind of measure of success for an exchange then density, or should we also be looking at, or instead looking at making sure that all the needed housing types are going to be accounted for, allowed, and then their production supported in this kind of an exchange? And I hope that question made sense.
Any acknowledged HCA, whether you are a city under 10,000 and don't have a cyclical every 8-year requirement, or whether the HCA is through the cyclical every 8 years required to do an HCA. If at some point you see land within your UGB that for whatever reason is not available for development within that planning period, the 20-year planning period, and you want to exchange it out, you can use the analysis in that adopted and acknowledged HCA to say, here's our need and our capacity. We're just going to exchange this out, these quantity of acres, and we're going to bring these in, and here's our new capacity. And it still addresses the need in the same way that that acknowledged HCA did.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Okay,
Steve,
thanks,
I
Daniel.
was just gonna just chime in to say that I agree with Cotton's description there.
Great. Thanks for the question, Damien. Heather.
So I also am still having a little bit of a hard time with A and B. And I hear the idea about getting rid of A, but I think one of the things about the 10% and thinking about that you have to be within 10% of the amount of residential land removed as measured in acres. I wonder if it could be as measured in acres or in assumed capacity, because part of what I'm thinking about that you might just really simply, like if you've got really sloped land that doesn't have any unbuildable area per se, but it's not going to get developed and you want to do an exchange, and I think this is a little bit to Mary Kyle's point yesterday or earlier, but just not about protected land. You might be able to exchange acres that are nearby, but they might not be sloped, they might be flatter. And so you actually could get more housing on less land, even though it is zoned for the same. I don't know, maybe the reason it's written the way it is because you're saying you don't have to do that capacity analysis as long as it's zoned the same. Then you're trying to reduce the burden on the city by saying, hey, if the acres are the same and it's zoned the same, then we're not going to make you do a capacity analysis. Is that kind of what you're saying? Okay.
That's right.
Okay. And then on the employment and public land exchange part, I agreed with Martha about I got a little bit confused there, and I just wondered if maybe public land was just missing from some of the references where it talked about employment land, but it just kind of some of the later references didn't include, they just refer back to employment uses and not employment uses and or public land uses. But I like the idea of saying getting rid of employment and public land and just saying non-residential uses. I think that I like that simplicity there a lot. Thanks.
Thank you, Heather. Brock.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with Damien and with Martha, especially around the employment and public lands piece that Heather just mentioned, as well as the removing some from the language and capital B in both parts. Same or higher. So if you have a city that, let's say, has enough zone capacity for high density housing, but doesn't have enough zone capacity to meet their lower density housing need, if we're saying just the same or higher, I think it seems like we're creating a situation where we are removing the ability of a city to address it using this tool. I'm not sure the density piece there is necessary.
Okay. Thanks, Brock. Thanks, everyone, for your questions and comments. It looks like we might be ready to move on to our next topic, Kevin.
All right. So back to, we're not going to do a poll on this one because it's not a version 1. It's a refinement of, it's a version 2. So we assume our clarifying questions are originally taken care of, and now we'll discuss some of the refinements. But hopefully you'll see some refinements here reflected from feedback we got within the meeting and then after the meeting, and then we've done some work directly with some TAC members to work on this. So if you want to go to the next slide. You guys saw this last time we talked about it, our statutory authority, where that comes from. And just to reiterate that the legislature finds that this kind of long-range planning can provide greater certainty for both agricultural and forest industries, as well as commerce and other industries, including the housing industry. You'll see this reinforced within Goal 14 and existing rules, where it asks cities to look at the inclusion of land within an urban reserve shall be based upon the location factors within your Goal 14, and a demonstration that there are no other reasonable alternatives that will require less or have less effect upon resource land. So we see that through the statute, through the goals, and into existing rules. Next slide. So what were some of the refinements? What are the highlights of what we're accomplishing here? Mitigating skipping over priority 1 lands, as Jenna said, towards accountability. Within the statutes, it asks us to look at balancing both agriculture and forest land industries with commerce and other industries like housing. So mitigating skipping over that priority scheme. We add a threshold, 80% of the original URA land or previous URA land should be included into the UGB before any subsequent new URA land can be added. And that's pretty consistent with what you already see in Rule Division 30, Sub 2. It asks cities to demonstrate that there are no reasonable alternatives with less or have less effect upon the resource lands. Then you'll see Division 30, Sub 3 has a prioritization scheme. We clarify and add some specificity going from 3 categories of prioritization to 5. You'll see that that really lines up well. One of the pieces of feedback we got in discussions from the TAC membership was looking at consistency and alignment between Division 21 and 24. You'll see that those align really well. And then I think what we shared at the RAC meeting is we also went ahead and looked at 197A 245, and that's sub 6 A through F. And we looked at that and compared with 197A 285C and just saw, within the divisions of Division 24 and 21, where can we add alignment? And then how did the statutes align between those? And so we took that view, and you'll see that reflected in the rules. Last, we had a new piece of legislation. So our next slide, Senate Bill 1129 in this session asked us to do a couple more things. Give lower priority to those first category high priority lands where a residential plan development or a subdivision are present. So we worked with some TAC members on how we could do that. And then give lower priority to the inclusion of otherwise high priority lands where providing urban services are not reasonable or cost effective due to physical constraints. This is pretty much the status quo, although it really focused on physical constraints and the ability to provide service within reason we've added, or this direction from the bill asks us to add cost effective to really think about the cost of those public services. So you'll see that in your draft rules. And I think the next couple slides we've seen before, but I'll go through them quickly. So what does it look like when you take 3 prioritization categories that already exist in rule and you specify and expand those out to 5? It just tells you in that 3rd category, you cannot, while you can bring in agriculture and forestry, you cannot bring the high value. And high value is defined in statute at 195.300. That 4th category then tells you there's a subset of high value farmland that's very specific. This subset is of a higher value, and that's defined in statute 215, 710 sub 1. The 4th category, while you can bring in what was prohibited in the 3rd category, there's this new subcategory that you cannot bring in. And the 5th category goes on to specify that at this very last category, the highest of the high value farm and forest lands comprised of prime and unique soils. That's where you would start to make findings and say there are no other alternatives. As a 5th and last resort, we would bring these in. Next slide is identical to what I just said. It just depicts it in a different way. What's your hierarchy? We've all seen this hierarchy throughout the statutes, and certainly this is the hierarchy that Goal 14, and we're all working under Goal 14 reinforces. So in summary, our very last slide, we maintain the need for cities to use the agricultural land capability classification system or the cubic foot site class system when adding farm and forest land. You'll see that consistent in the rules. And we add the provision that all of this is with exception to what Senate Bill 1129 now directs us to do, that if it is not reasonable or cost effective due physical constraints, land of higher priority may be given lower priority within the classification. And that is a brief overview of what was summarized in your memo and then what's specified in your proposed draft rules. Steve, I'll hand it over to you.
All right, Martha. Thanks, Ken. Martha, you want to start us off again?
Okay, thanks. Can you clarify for me, you made a comment how this is consistent with Division 24, and I thought Division 24 still, which is the urban growth boundaries, right? Still has this like 3 priority system. Are you saying that the proposal is to change a priority system both for urban reserves and urban growth boundaries to this? No?
No, help me out with this, Kevin. I always get this wrong. Division 24 currently has 4 priorities, 4 categories. Statutes for Division 24 can be found in 197A to 85C. That statute that governs Division 24 has 5 categories. And I think what I shared last time we talked about this in June, I shared that House Bill 2001 requires us. So House Bill 2001 from the 2023 session, our owner rulemaking bill, required us to create a 5th category within Division 24. So for henceforth, Division 24 will state that urban reserves alone are their first category. So Division 24 under House Bill 2001 went from 4 categories to 5. We're proposing Division 21 go from 3 to 5. So both divisions.
The categories are different, and I guess I'm confused as to. I feel like we had this conversation in the last round, and I'm sorry to interrupt you. Is there a reason that these should be different? It just seems a little confusing.
Are. I did a side-by-side comparison and created a table. I'm happy to send that out. I did not see that they were different.
So you're proposing to make these changes also in Division 24?
I'm not proposing any more changes. The existing Division 24
uses this language.
Uses this, is very similar. Okay. Yeah, the intent and the practice, 2nd priority, yeah, 3rd priority, 4th priority, 5th priority. Yeah, all 2 through 5 priorities in Division 24 mirrored what we have here.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. But if there's any tweaks to language folks want to see in Division 24, please provide those via email.
Thanks, Martha. Brock.
Yeah, a few things here. One on one of the slides that you showed, one of the bullet points that you had was addressing a concern about skipping over priority one lands. I'm wondering if you can elaborate on that a little bit more. Two, you said you compared this with 1978245 and 285. How is 245 reflected in this? Because I don't, other than in the citation below the rule, I don't see that statute or the content of that subsection 6, which is supposed to show your priority, included in this at all. And so I'm a little bit bewildered by how that's apparently being implemented here. I really don't, I can't think of a good rationalization, so I'm hoping I can get a little help with that.
Yeah, I see a couple of questions I can add a little bit too, and we won't get into full discussion back and forth here, but certainly I can address the rationale. And I think it's the same that I shared back in June. That once land is brought into an urban reserve, whether it's non-resource land or exception land or farmland, the prioritization is flattened and there's no hierarchy within the reserves. And that allows a city to go and include into their UGB farmland or forest land in lieu of exception land or non-resource land. Once it's in the reserve, it's open. But as reserves are amended, as that 50-year supply of land over the course of time expands a URA or an urban reserve area, you'll have a second generation urban reserve area. So new land has been added. And so in lieu of skipping over all the exception land in an original URA, 80% of that first URA must be brought into the UGB before you can start using the newer lands. And I think the way I've heard it characterized that I've kind of become enamored with is your urban reserve area is a pie. And the pie is not the end all finite. You can get a second pie. But that original urban reserve area or that original pie, you have to consume 80% of that before you start dipping your fork into that second pie, that second generation, third generation. So I think that's similar to what I explained in June. And then as far as how the rules reflect the statute, you'll see that the prioritization of land in Division 21, Rule 30, Sub 3, it already prioritizes land per statute. Here we just add some specificity with 2 new categories. So it's consistent.
That's what I'm confused by, is that I don't see anything in that rule that prioritizes according to the order that's directed in statute. The statute itself is not cited. That there's nothing that links to it, and especially in 3 where it says land found suitable can only be included only according to the following priorities. That is blatantly in violation of what the statute says the rule should do. The statute says you bring in land based on its development capability, right? Can it have public services? Can it be walkable? Can it work with natural ecosystems? Does it support your housing needs? That is not what this prioritization scheme references at all. In fact, it doesn't reference it anywhere.
Thanks, Brock.
And to the 80% piece as well, I don't understand where that comes from either. I get that what you were saying about wanting to have predictability about where UGBs and urban reserves are going to go next and where development's going to occur next. But if you bring in land, one of the things that we were talking about earlier, whether it was, I can't remember if it was for urban reserves or if it was for UGBs, but you're getting more information about the constraints on that land, about the development capability of that land once you bring it in. And so if you bring that into your urban reserve and you realize that it's not actually as capable of developing housing as you thought it was, now there's portions that you're going to have to bring that into your UGB anyway before you do another expansion. I can't think of a good rationale for that.
Thanks, Brock. All right, Damien.
Thanks. Got one one comment, one question. So I deal with the comment first. So under, let's see, page 3, 3A, new I. Thank you for the addition of subdivision plat as defined in statute. I shared that with somebody who asked the question, okay, that's great. What do we do if we've got land that we're looking at it for an urban reserve, and a subdivision hasn't been platted, but somebody's in process with Deschutes County, they just haven't finished it yet. So, my question is, how is this broad enough to address this kind of situations, or do we need to consider an addition regarding defining plan development or recognizing properties that may be in process of developing, and also acknowledging that some properties go through a process for development, but they never finish. My question is under 3 C, D, and E, and I may have answered it, but I want to confirm. When I was looking at the differences between 3C and 3D, there's different citations to statute regarding high value farmland. In 3C, high value farmland is, the definition is under ORS 195-310, and under D, the reference is to high value farmland as defined under ORS 215-710-1. So I wanted to ask if the definition used in D is a higher standard entered that needs to be addressed, or what? So that's my comment, my question.
Yeah, thanks for the comment. I'll look at that, Damien. I know we worked closely with you on what we have, and we'll continue to work closely with you to refine it, and others who have inputs based on Damien's comment. And I'm certainly not a farm and forest specialist, so Kevin, help me out. You've been with the agency, but we sat down with our farm and forest specialist, and my understanding is that 215-710-1 is a subset, a very special subset of ORS 195-300. And she went on to explain to me, we got into like lily farms on the coast. I'm not even going to attempt to explain that, Damien, but there were some that were created at one period of time and then a subset created in a ladder. And so it is ORS 95-300 is a broader category, and ORS 215-710 is a narrower category.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Kevin, were you trying to chime in on this? I see you're unmuted.
No, I agree with Karin. I believe this is just a further refinement, but we will touch base with our rural lands expert to make sure these are the correct citations. Thanks.
All right. Heather.
Thanks. I had a question about when it says that under, sorry, taking notes here. Under 3AI, land within the first priority category may be given lower priority compared to other non-resource land. So any other lower priority, as long as it's referred to, as long as that priority grouping of land is non-resource land. So like a jurisdiction could put it in the same level with any other grouping. Do you see what I'm trying to say? Because it doesn't say like what level of lower priority. Is it just the next level of lower, or is it any of the other levels, any of the other priorities, as long as they are not resource land priority groupings? Is that how you would interpret that?
We talked about this a lot internally, and it seems, yeah, Kevin, help me out, and others, certainly Maddie and Jen. I know we talked round and round department-wide beyond just the housing division, but it's a cascading. So within the first priority, are your exception lands and your non-resource lands. And then you look within those, which ones have planned developments or subdivisions. Oh, these don't, so I'm going to take that first. And then the only way you're jumping from one category to another is if it's cost prohibitive or unreasonable due to physical or topographical constraints. Then you're saying, okay, it's unreasonable to provide or cost prohibitive to provide urban services. And we can start cascading down the priority list, looking for land that is cost effective or reasonable due to physical constraints. But that first priority category, you're skipping over lands with planned development or subdivisions that allows you to do that.
And if it wasn't obvious that that first category isn't sufficient to meet your need.
Okay.
You can skip over any planned development. Well, planned developments as with subdivision plats.
Okay, thanks. Alexandra.
I'm going to kind of pull us back to something that Brock said earlier about the inclusion of lands in the URA and, needing to consume all of the lands within the URA in order to expand the URA or a certain portion. I think I have some concern about that particular provision, just because I think about going back to a conversation earlier, lands that were included within UGBs that never should have been included. And Brock touched on this slightly, where like we may in future discover that for whatever reason, this land that was included in the URA is not actually really suitable for urban development for whatever reason. Be it, we find, I don't know, some soil there that is just wonderful, or we can't predict the future. And so, I think there are multiple ways to address that. Either a way to back things out of a URA if it's really clear that development is just not going to be possible. Even kind of within a longer planning horizon, or there may be a better use for it, a city county process. I don't know what that looks like. Or just kind of removal of that provision at this time with the intention of coming back and creating some kind of URA back out process at a later date.
Thank you. Great, thanks. All right, Martha.
Yeah. A couple of things. And where do I start? So under on page 3, 3a, your addition of exception area as defined in ORS 197732. Check that reference if you would, please. I don't think that's not really a definition of exception area. There actually is a definition of exception area in OAR 660.021.00104, I think. And I'm curious why you didn't use that definition. The reference to the statute is, I mean, kind of a definition of exception area, but it talks about how you get an exception, or how you get a new exception area. And then under sub I, under there, again, it's a language thing. I don't think you mean you're giving it lower priority compared to other non-resource lands within an exception area, because non-resource lands and exception areas are actually different things. They're not necessarily one inside the other. So if you would just clarify that. And then I'm going to go back to this, the C, D, and E. And so I did pull open Division 24. C, D, and E are different than Division 24 and third priority and fourth priority. I mean, I think the intent is the same, but the way that C, D, and E is written is, to me, way more confusing than the third priority and fourth priority in Division 24. And I don't know why you wouldn't just have them exactly the same, to be less confusing. And then regarding the farmland references, because I am a county planner, I looked those up because it was confusing me too. And you're right, the reference to 195-310 is a broader definition of high value farmland. And again, I'm not sure this is the right reference. There's a reference in the OAR that might be better, but what I think what you're trying to get at in 215-710-1, it specifies only certain types of high value farmland. It's class 1, class 2, unique and prime soils. So like the best of the best, like there's other high value farmland, but those are the best of the best. And I understand pulling those out. But then in E, all of that, if we're keeping this structure, all of that should be put back in, because what you're missing, you should just make it the same reference to the 215.710. When you're adding, you're saying, oh, you can do prime and unique soils, but you never add in the class 1 and class 2 that were pulled out. Does that make sense? And so if we're keeping the structure with the C, D, and E, please make sure that E does include all the rest of the high value soils that you're excluding in D. But I also will go back again. I think that this is more confusing and complicated and doesn't do anything significantly different than the way the language is in Division 24 right now. That's my opinion.
Yeah, thank you. I think Kevin and I sat down with our rural planning folks and our farm and forest specialists, so we can't take full ownership for all of this language. It was a collaborative, but if they have, maybe I will get them to write up for this group their kind of rationale of how they chose to do this.
Well, I guess alternatively, if this is the language we want to go with, can we put it in Division 24? Like it's about consistency and having the same sort of rules for both. But anyway, I'll move on. I have one more comment. I am going to ask you, please, 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 on the next page 4A, please be very clear which urban services you're talking about. And I know that this reference to urban services defined in ORS 195.065 came from some middle housing stuff. And I can tell you that reference has caused us a lot of problem, because ORS 195.065 talks about urban service agreements. It has this really long list of urban services that includes recreation and open space and parks and fire protection and water. And so what happens is you get people who want to argue against what you're doing, saying, well, we don't have sufficient parks, and so therefore we, like, how do you know that? I think what we're really talking about is access to sewer, water, and maybe transportation. And I just would like you to be very clear which of those services that you're talking about, so it doesn't become this big back and forth about, well, we don't think there's adequate fire protection. Like, how do you know, right? I don't think that's what you mean is fire protection. Maybe you do. Maybe you meant all of that whole list. But I can tell you that that reference did cause us a lot of angst in the middle housing House Bill, the original House Bill 2001. So
thanks,
that's it for
Martha.
me right now. Yep.
Corey and then Brock. Oh, sorry, Beth. Before you go, Corey, Beth, was there something you wanted to say specific to this?
It's very minor. The current Division 24 does not match statute. I think we've said that. But first priority in Division 24 includes urban reserves, exceptions, and non-resource land. That needs to be split out to match statute, so that first priority is urban reserves. And so that makes it super confusing, Martha. I was tripping up on this earlier.
No, I understand that. I guess I'm talking about the references to the high value and non-high value farmland. Like, I understand that that's going to be added sort of to the top.
Okay, just making sure.
Yep.
Thanks both. Corey.
Yeah, thanks. Just a few comments. I really appreciated the discussion today and hearing from folks. On 3A little I just wanted to share that our interpretation of that is that it does sync with the legislative intent. I think I shared in past meetings for Senate Bill 1129. We were pretty involved with those discussions and the formation of that, and just wanted to share that feedback. And then for C, D, and E, I also have a rural lands team that I'm checking with on this piece. And so we'll probably have some written comments for the team following that analysis. So just wanted to mention that. And then just a quick comment on the urban growth boundary expansion, the 62, the 80% piece. I think that looking back, and I appreciated you all reminding us of what House Bill 2021, the charge that it gives us, but that kind of D part of that really keys in on the supporting coordinated public facilities planning, annexation, and comp plan amendments to facilitate the development of lands brought into the urban growth boundary. And so I feel like that specific provision really is the direct way of implementing that charge from the legislation. So I felt like that was an important piece to have in here. because I think we all know how tricky annexation can be. And so having further ability to make sure that when lands are in the urban reserve and then moving them into the UGB, we do need some better ways to make sure that those actions are actually happening. Thanks.
Thank you, Corey. Brock.
Yeah, to Martha's point with the 195.065, I don't think that includes stormwater either. But we have a usable definition of public facilities in Division 8. It seems like that might be what we want to reference there. Martha, don't mean to put words in your mouth, but just it seems like we're on the same page with that. For the planned developments or subdivisions, Karen, earlier you specified, so the ones with a subdivision plat, right, would be able to be skipped over. I guess kind of two questions, and one is more for my own understanding, but are there planned developments or subdivisions that don't end up with a subdivision plat?
I think it's pretty rare, at least the champions of Senate Bill 1129 from the Deschutes County and representatives from Bend, they're feeling like all of those planned developments around their area most of them would have plats. But I can't speak for the entire state.
So,
Brock, can we have Damien chime in on that before you continue?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So some background on the term subdivision plat and why we recommended it. Using Bend as an example, if you were to, look at a Google Maps view of Bend, say looking east, you would see a number of subdivisions. They would appear as subdivisions because you would see houses clustered together along streets. You'd be able to find their subdivision plat maps with the county clerk. And a number of these were approved before the county had any zoning. They had 30 to approve plats, but they didn't approve zoning. Some were approved as planned developments before the county had a Senate Bill 100 compliant comprehensive plan. And they provided for, smaller lot sizes, open spaces, creation of covenants, conditions, and restrictions. And so we were trying to capture both of those kind of situations where you might have had just a subdivision plat that was recorded that said, here's block 1 and all the lots within it on this street. Or you had a situation where a plat was recorded after the county had issued a land use decision approving some kind of a planned development.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that.
Thanks,
I get why this works for Bend. I guess my question is if there are planned communities and subdivisions that, while maybe rare, don't have a subdivision plat there, is the intent that be pulled out? Because that seems like something that would have been done in the bill. My point here is that I think planned developments and subdivisions are kind of a common knowledge term. And I think it makes sense for flexibility, not just for Bend, but for any city that, is considering this. It might make sense to not have such a refined definition and just leave it as a common knowledge term so that it can be more broadly applicable.
Thanks, Brock. All right. Martha.
Thanks. I was going to weigh on the subdivision plat, but honestly, I could probably go either way with it. There are certainly areas in counties outside of urban growth boundaries that have small lots that are not part of a subdivision. And I guess I don't know that we would really want to necessarily be able to exclude all of those, right? And so I feel like the subdivision and planned unit was kind of a specific thing, and I don't personally have a lot of angst about it limiting to only ones that are platted, because I think in the longer term, it's going to result in fewer exception land properties being sort of skipped over or made lower priority. And maybe that's a good thing. I don't know. I also wanted to weigh in a little bit on this 80% thing. And I originally, when I read it, it made me twitch, but I guess it doesn't really cause me as much angst now that I've thought about it more, because I think what it's saying is that if you are a jurisdiction who has an urban reserve, and then you're amending your urban reserve, you have to use that first initial part first. But is there anything that says when you're amending your urban reserve, you can't take some of it away and add it or reconfigure it? I mean, it seems like it
That is
seems like
allowed to adjust. Yeah, just to answer that
Yeah.
question, existing rules allow you to adjust your.
So it seems like you would take care of that issue when you were doing your urban reserve amendment. And I mean, the fact of the matter is, all of these things are extraordinarily hard to do. There's not a lot of cities that have urban reserves. It's a hard process, and they're not constantly revising them. Like, it is a long, expensive, hard process to do the analysis and designate the urban reserve. And I feel like they're not amending them very much at all or very quickly. So I think the risk is pretty low here that you would have something in your urban reserve that you were forced to bring in somehow. But that's my thought.
Thank you, Martha. Heather.
Thank you. Just to follow up on that, I think a little bit different take on the 80% is that if it is low risk, then I'm wondering why we need to have it in there. So I think we're trying to incentivize, right, cities to do urban reserves. And I feel like if we put this threshold in there that you have to have brought in at least 80% of your urban reserves, then that 80% means really different things depending on the size of the urban reserves. So it could be like if they only did a 10-year urban reserve, let's say, and I know that's being changed to now a 20-year urban reserve, but it still could not be very big. And it costs a lot to do a UGB expansion and serve that area and all of those things to then need to expand again. So I just wonder if it isn't if it is a low risk thing, then maybe we don't need the 80% piece in there to begin with. So that's just a comment. I also wanted to concur with Martha's earlier comments about 3 and the kind of priorities. I still find I think we looked at 3 and then looked at the other prioritization scheme for expansion, and it does feel like there could be some more syncing up in language. And honestly, I really loved the slide that you showed in the presentation before we got to this topic that was like first priority, second priority, third priority, and doesn't repeat a lot of the language in each of the different priorities. And so if we're trying to simplify, I think we submitted comments over email with some, the one before this, the slide before this. Oh, where is it? Was bullet? Yes. Wouldn't it be so cool if our rules could be that simple? But anyway, so I just want to put that out there that we sent some comments about like, if 3 said if land of a higher priority is inadequate to accommodate the amount of land estimated in section 1 of this rule, the next priority for inclusion shall be according to the following order. And then it's like first priority goes to exception on resource land. Second, and just kind of walks through it just like you did on this slide. So I just wanted to mention that.
And Heather, before we
Yeah.
go on, I'll just state that if there are any suggestions to tweak the language between 21 and 24 that you see opportunities for alignment, please go ahead. And I know your teams, you've already taken draft rules back to your team, consulted with your full team, but email those in and we will certainly take a look at those. And then just for the broader group, that goes to everybody. If you want to take things back to your rural team or back to your jurisdictional team, and please email us any comments. But I think the difference between what you see here in the slide is this is my language, the way I process is what you see on the slide. By no means would it get past our Department of Justice and legal experts. Like, they're just not going to accept my I can simplify the language as much as possible, but we really lean on our rural team, our farm and forest specialists, and then everything has to pass the legalities of Department of Justice legal review. So we as a team will try to simplify it as much as possible. We may not be able to strip out all the language that is an existing, a lot of the language is an existing rule today. So we'll see. We'll certainly make every effort.
Yeah, and I said that really flippantly, honestly. I mean, we deal with our legal team all the time, so I totally get that, the box that you're put in. And we did email actual language revisions on this when we talked about it last time, that again, just take a lot of the existing language and put it up in 3 so it's not repeated multiple times. But again, and then seconding the idea of really making sure that the 2 priority schemes are matched up. But yeah, I'll go ahead and send that again. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Brock.
Yeah, and I'll keep this high level. So how does adding new considerations to the priority order and rule and adding requirements like the 80% one, how is that simplifying process? How is that reducing procedural redundancy, right? How is that increasing legal certainty for local governments pursuing these kinds of projects? And how does it do so, especially for small cities, which was the portion of the Section 9, subsection 2 of House Bill 2001 that wasn't highlighted on the slide? Because that, especially for small cities piece, is really important here, right? If Metro can go in and do their urban reserve planning, that's great. But they have what, 42 or so cities plus the regional government that can all kind of help out with that in some way. But if we're looking at Prineville, for example, small, like just over 10,000, right? Not a whole lot of capacity. Might be one of those cities where, their planning department is one person and they only do that half time, and half the time they do something else with the city. They're not going to be able to go through and do this. I don't know how this is meeting that legislative direction to reduce analytical burden, to
Thanks,
provide
Brock.
extra certainty.
Yeah, I think one thing that maybe I didn't hear earlier, but I think is important to remember is that another part of that is protecting resource lands, and I think that's where, I don't want to speak for the department, but I know in our conversation that protecting resource lands or balancing the reducing of analytical burden, et cetera, but still balancing those with the protection of resource lands is what is part of that, right? Right after the provision about small cities.
Right, but that's that's just as concerning to me. Because if that's the interpretation, right, then we are saying it is so important to protect resource land that it doesn't matter that we were directed to simplify this and make it easier to use. In fact, if we were to do that, it would hurt resource land. That speaks to a fundamental problem with the way that our system operates in itself, right? If we cannot simplify a process because of one specific, and not even protect resource lands and make it easy, right? It's make it easy. Don't just open the floodgates so that you pave the entire state, right? That would be inconsistent with the protection of resource lands. But the fact of the matter is we've added 949,000 acres of EFU land on top of what we already had before 1989. And we're not even down to 875,000 of those 949,000 acres that were added. So it's not like we're not protecting resource land. According to your own reports from the commission, we still have more than 875,000 acres more of EFU land than we had in 1989. So if the goal was to make sure that 1989 number stays as close to 100% preserved in EFU land as possible, there's a lot of room to go. I mean, at this rate, it would take us like 300 to 600 years just to eat through that extra 800,000 acres.
Thanks, Brock. Ethan, did you want to weigh in on this?
I
saw that you were unmuted. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Maybe that wasn't intentional.
Yeah, not. I think one of the. So definitely curious to hear the how syncing up the approaches here is adding an analytical burden. I'd love to hear reflections on that. And then
Because you're having to analyze which soils are in the first type of farmland versus the second type of farmland versus the third type of farmland, but apparently not class 1 or 2, as Martha had noted, right? That is extra level of analysis that you have to do, go through and look through the soil capability for each one, the cubic foot site class, right? That is extra analysis. Plus it increases risk of legal challenge, right? Because someone might come in and say, hey, you said that was class 3, actually it's class 2. So you can't bring that part in, you have to go redo this. That's not adding legal certainty. It's not minimizing analytical burden.
Thanks, Brock. I don't if sorry if I put you on the spot, Ethan. I didn't mean to do that. If you didn't mean to chime in, we can either you can comment or we can go to Martha.
yeah, go to Martha real quick.
Yep.
Yeah, I know we're trying to wrap up. I mean, I think that the important thing to keep in mind is that you've always had to do that analysis. It's just worded differently in here. And when I said I think it's more confusing, I think it, for me, I guess I don't really have a problem with the way it's worded currently in Division 24. In some ways, maybe this is more specific, and if we can figure out the wording, it might be easier, but then they should both be the same. Like, I don't like being confused because there's two different rules that I think are supposed to mean the same thing, but they're worded differently, so maybe they don't. And that was the point that I was trying to get at about it being confusing to me. I also don't necessarily think there's anything wrong with the way the language is in Division 24, but if we can make it better, that's great, and make it more understandable for people. But these additions are not actually adding analysis. They're just sort of articulating it differently.
Thanks, Martha. And thanks, everyone. I mean, we'll obviously appreciate your comments and we'll take another look at things. Heard a lot about the prioritization. Oh, Maddie, did you want to say something?
Just that I appreciate the spotlight on some of the wording and of course your feedback, advisory members, is invaluable to us because we're working within a space where we might not know what we don't know, and so the feedback that you're providing is really valuable to us. I think, Brock, one of the things that we might want to do is take a step back and make that assessment of whether or not the rules in their entirety reduce analytical burden and or reduce the levels of uncertainty for different size cities, especially, I guess, to foreshadow that we will be looking at Division 24 in its entirety in our next conversation. And to make that assessment now would maybe preempt or prejudge how the system works together. So I just appreciate if maybe you took that viewpoint and asked the question after we are able to review a lot of these rules in their entirety in the division as a whole. So I think it really only works as a system. And if we were to dive into this one section around soil classifications, I think all of us, with some exception, thanks for those of you in the room who have a lot more experience with it, I think a lot of us might get a little wrapped around the axle. So thanks for your comments. We're really appreciative that you are keeping us on task that way. But I think there is an opportunity in our next conversation around the entirety of Division 24 to assess whether or not we're keeping to our charge and whether or not we're being successful in that work.
All right. That seems like a good time to wrap up that conversation. And again, thanks everyone, both on UGB exchanges and urban reserves, a lot for the team to go back and look at. In terms of upcoming dates to note, I'm going to hand it over to Karin to review. Well, actually, first I'll say, oh, we have it on the slide. So there's an LCDC meeting on September 25th and 26th, and I think the morning of the 26th is when OHNA is going to be discussed. There is an LCDC public hearing on October 23rd that you should be aware of. And the next RAC meeting, they have a little break and staff gets a little break from RAC meetings. Their next meeting is October 29th. Our next meeting is going to be on Tuesday, September 16th. And this is where I will hand it over to Colin to talk about our upcoming schedule.
Yeah, you'll see that we're running into some logistics, whether it's an LCDC meeting or the Oregon chapter of the American Planning Association is having a conference in October. And so you'll see some of our CalTAC meetings have moved to Tuesdays. So please, that should be on your calendar. Please look at that if it's a Tuesday rather than a Thursday. We'll try to get those packets out early. But in addition, the month of October, so next month, we're coming up around some logistics. Several of you and several of us will be in Bend for Oregon OAPA. Thanks for hosting us, City of Bend. We'll all come visit you and hang out. Hopefully we can have a cold beverage of some sort together. But that means that we have to move. Right now on your calendar is October 16th. And we're also looking at the commission's packet that will be published, I think, right around October 9th or 10th for that October 23rd LCDC hearing. And so we are thinking about consolidating both of the TAC meetings in October into one. And we haven't landed on a date yet. It'll probably land on a Tuesday because it seems like Thursdays in October just got all booked. We don't know how that happened. So look out for that. And then we will discuss, the draft rules that are going to the public hearing for October for LCDC. We'll talk about all the feedback that we've gotten, what we've done with that feedback. You guys have already seen how we are working through feedback and what gets incorporated, and sort of how we're interpreting the legislative direction and the charge from LCDC, and then how we're making recommendations on the proposed draft rule amendments. So we'll talk through all of that in October. But just to reiterate what Maddie just said, we'll be doing a holistic view of Division 24. And we can really get into, I think it'll be good for us to talk about any alignments there where we can add further clarity, or if you want to see identical language or very similar language between 24 and 21.
Thank you, Colin. Okay, and thanks again. Oh, Martha, what do you got?
I think I saw somewhere, is October 1st when the draft rules are going to be released, and that's the start of the sort of official public comment period?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks for that addition, and we will see you all on Tuesday, September 16th. Thanks again, everyone. Have a good afternoon.